Alrighty, welcome to Brewing Like a Boss for Beginners. I am the author of the instruction manual in this presentation. My name is Cheyenne Weber. Basically, how I composed both was I did a walkthrough of a brewery on a manufacturer level, got all the tips and tricks from a pro right there. And then I did another walkthrough of a home brewer in his garage, and I took all of the tips and tricks of that trade and I combined it all into Brewing Like a Boss for Beginners for people who are like me and they get an instruction manual and they still don't understand how to follow each individual step, so it kind of breaks it down into more of a fundamental step by step by step type of learning manual. And also, it's for people who, like me, they want to start something new, but they don't want to be like a beginner. They don't want to make the beginner's mistakes. They want to be able to brew like a boss, even as a beginner. So what you'll need is your Brewing Like a Boss for Beginners instruction manual, as well as your Northern Brewery starter kit that you have purchased from northernbrewery.com. Also, what you'll need is a Brewing Like a Boss mindset. So what that basically means is patience and attention to detail. Before you begin, here's some of the keys to success. Some of the things that might seem like a no-brainer, but for people like myself and others, you need a little bit of reminding on it. Read the manual fully. It's not one of those things where you can just read it as you go, because there are a lot of simultaneous steps. So while the wort is cooling, do this. You've noticed that in the manual. And there is actually a lot of steps that are like that in the brewing process. While you're waiting for this, you can be doing this, and there's also a lot of sanitization and prep that is important that you'll need to make mental notes of in the instruction manual. Secondly, you need to secure a spot. Might seem like a no-brainer, but the brewing process actually, it creates a lot of external heat. You might think that, oh, I'm ready for it. You're going to want a well-ventilated area. You're going to want a lot of windows, fans. That's why a lot of people that are home brewers, they do it in their garage, so they can just open up their garage door whenever it gets a little too hot in there. But for the fermenting process, you are going to want it to be very, very dark and cold. This also helps a lot of people. They want to keep their areas, their brewing area and their fermenting area, and keep it relatively close, so you're not doing a lot of the bending over and pulling up and carrying. This will save your body a lot of wear and tear as well. And lastly, the key to success is allot your time properly, a lot of time management. I know that there's a lot of things going on in the world today, but if you're going to brew beer like a boss, you need to be aware that the brewing process alone takes 6 hours. I would typically add another 2 just for the prepping and the cleanup process. So you're looking at about 8 hours just for the brewing process if you add all of that in there. And the fermenting process is 2 to 3 weeks, so 14 to 21 days. Just make sure that you're going into this process knowing full well that it is not a microwavable dinner. Brewing beer and brewing a very good beer like a boss, it does take a little bit of time, but everything is worthwhile and like it does. Cold break like a boss. Now this is the process of, while your wort is chilling, this is how you need to make sure that your wort chills. Instead of doing an ice bath like a lot of people do, it's actually more efficient to use an immersion chiller. This is just a little tip from the pros. Instead of using an ice bath, that'll gradually take your wort down to the pitching temperature. And pitching just is when you add your yeast. That's what they call it, is the pitching your yeast, adding your yeast temperature. Um, a lot of people use copper coils, like you can see in the corner right here of the slide. You use copper coil. You have to make sure that you sanitize it before you drop it into your wort. You want to take your wort, in order to get a good cold break, you want to take your wort from its boiling rate that it was at about 160. You want to get it down to 80 degrees as quickly as possible. You'll pitch your yeast at 80 degrees, but you're still going to want your wort to get down to about 67 degrees, 57, whether it's an ale or a lager, it'll depend. Um, but you're going to want to use an immersion chiller to get your temperature from your wort down to from 160 down to 80 degrees, so you can pitch your yeast and get that fermenting process going quicker. The quicker the cooling process, it creates a better cold break. And the cold break is basically just when all the proteins in the beer, they start to drop to the bottom, so they coagulate. Take the temperature of your wort about every 5 minutes until it reaches 80 degrees. So make sure that while your wort is cooling, you're doing it as efficiently and as quickly as possible, as sanitary as possible. But you also want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on that temperature because you want it to drop quickly, but you don't want to add your yeast too soon or too late. There really is no too late though. You want to make sure that you hit it at that 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's some more frequently asked questions in the brewing process, especially the home brewing process. How do I know when my home brew is done fermenting and ready to bottle? You're going to use your hydrometer. I believe in the Northern Brewer Starter Kit, it's actually the Herkilometer. It's the same thing. It's a hydrometer. It measures the final gravity in your beer. You'll take it, make sure that everything that comes into contact with your beer, with your wort, with your brew is sanitary. Make sure everything is clean. But you'll take the hydrometer, pour some of the brew in your test jar, use the hydrometer to measure your final gravity about every 1 to 2 days within that last week of the fermenting process. And you're going to want your final gravity to be between 1.01 and 1.02. That's 1.2. 1.012 is the points that you're going to want your final gravity to be at. You're going to want that final gravity to stay at that mark for about 2 days. You're going to want it to be consistent readings. And once you get that consistent reading of the 1.01 to the 1.012, that's when you know that your beer is done fermenting and it is ready to bottle. Can you ferment your beer too long? Yes, you actually can. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks with our Block Amber Ale. This one takes 14 to 21 days on average for the fermenting process. And after your yeast is done fermenting your beer, because how the fermenting process works is once you pitch your yeast, that yeast is eating all of the sugar in your wort. And after 2 to 3 weeks, it's done. So now you have all this inactive yeast that's sitting in your beer and it'll cause an off flavor. So just make sure that you're monitoring the final gravity of your beer. You want to keep it within that 1.01 to 1.012 mark. Keep it at that consistent final gravity. And once it hits that mark, you're ready to bottle your beer. How do you know if your beer has been contaminated? Excellent question. We stress sanitization in this process so much. If you are looking at your beer and it looks like there's a thin layer of ice, thin layer of oily ice at the top of your beer, that's the beginning process of the infection and it's been contaminated. So that's why we stress the sanitization process so much throughout the brewing process is you do not want a contaminated beer. You want to lessen the amount of oxygen that comes into contact with your beer. That's why we keep the fermenting bucket very secure and in a dark, cold area. But it's very difficult to have happen if you keep your prep area sanitized properly. Should I stir the beer while it is fermenting? Absolutely not. The fermenting process, what happens is you get a crozin that forms at the top, and that's basically just a foam that forms at the top, and all of the proteins during the fermenting process, they start to coagulate. And what that means is the proteins start to sink to the bottom. So when you pour from your fermenting bucket to your bottling bucket, you're gonna be leaving all that sludge behind. You don't want that in your beer in the final stages of your beer. You want the coagulated parts, the coagulated proteins to be at the bottom. And the crozin will get filtered out naturally. So you do not want to stir during the fermenting process because you will be messing all of that up. How long does it take for the beer to carbonate once bottled? So you take your wort, you go to your fermenting process. The fermenting process is 14 to 21 days. Once you read your final gravity, of 1.012 to 1.01. Yeah, 1.01 to 1.012. Then you are ready to carbonate. And that carbonation process is similar to the fermenting process. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks. Um, so just make sure that from the fermenting process you measure that final gravity, and once you get that gravity reading, then you are ready to carbonate and you're one step closer to tasting your beer. Here's some more reading. If you are interested in simplifying your home brewing process even more, I recommend the first book. It does even further breakdowns of recipe design, the origins of different brews and different flavors, and how to do half batch brewing. So if you don't want to use a 5 gallon bucket for your brewing process, we'll talk about how to do a 3 gallon or a 2.5. So they'll talk about how to do smaller batches of brew. If you are looking to get into brewing your own brew style and everything like that, I would recommend the second book, Designing Great Beers by Ray Daniels. A lot of the tips that I have in the manual and in this presentation, they're taken from these 3 books right here, as well as others. But this one, it actually provides you with tables so you can start making your own recipe, so you can start creating your own personalized brews. So if you're brewing like a boss, actually like a boss, this is the best book for you for all levels of brewing. This one right here, it'll help lead you through the branching out on your own from a beginner standpoint. How to Brew, this is another book that kind of pounds in the fundamentals of the brewing. So it goes through the top 5 priorities of brewing, which sanitization is one of them, surprise, surprise, and talks about all the little tricks and the tips that you can do to adjust your style of your brew or adjust the flavor of it. It also talks about managing your fermentation process a little bit closely, different options, different styles. So these are just some of the books that if you want to dive deeper into brewing like a boss as a beginner, these are great roadmaps to help you. I appreciate everybody coming to this presentation. I appreciate you looking at the manual, and brewing like a boss as a beginner has never been so easy until now. I'll see you on the other brew side. Have a good rest of your day, folks.